everyone, this is Pico Entertainment and we are back again, and here now we have another video for you, and this will be a spoiler review of Dune. Now you can catch up with my non-spoiler review of the movie, and I will leave the link within the description as well. Now just to quickly go over this movie, my overall thoughts was that it had the visuals and the scope and the overall aesthetics, but it was lacking in its overall story, and I think the lead character Paul himself was quite a bland protagonist of the film. And overall, I don't think this movie is quite the otherworldly science fiction cinematic experience that many are hoping it up to be. Yes, there is a certain dreamlike visual sense of the film overall, but I wouldn't say it's visually groundbreaking experience that we've never seen before. I think to an extent certain people are hyping up this film too much, and as I mentioned in my non-spoiler review, I think a lot of it is again that a lot of people want to see the return of much more of the serious concept-driven science fiction films that we certainly saw in the mid to late 70s and perhaps the early part of the 80s as well. And that kind of genre has really kind of phased out in the last 15 to 20 years. So that's why I think a lot of people want to see a return to that specific genre within mainstream movies. And while I think Dune was a decent film, I don't think it's quite that level yet that people are prompting it up to be. But overall, we'll see how well the film performs in its box office, and I'll report on that later on when we get the first figures of its opening weekend. Now in terms of this spoiler review itself, it won't be in any chronological order, but I'll just go over the main elements that I think were most stand out within the movie itself. So you have been warned finally. If you haven't yet seen the film, you want to check out this video now, go away and watch it, and then come back to this overall review. So the first element I want to talk about is probably the first quarter of the film, which I think was very slow. It made sense overall. There was nothing complicated or heavy-handed in terms of this overall story. As I mentioned in my non-spoiler review, I really think they kind of streamlines the narrative overall to make sure that non-fans could easily follow it. So there was nothing too heavy-handed in terms of the opening, but I just think it could have been delivered far more better. So basically we opened with Zendaya's narration of explaining planet Arrakis and the splice and how the hurricane would come down and really attacking the planet in terms of harvesting the splice. And again, we had many of those traits that I mentioned throughout my non-spoiler review in terms of the slow-mo, that we had all of Hans Zimmer's orchestral music. So it looked very well, but I think we could have gone for much more of an epic opening. You know, many people have compared this to Lord of the Rings, which it isn't, by the way. I think don't start making those kind of comparisons because this film falls way short of that. But we could have done, I feel, with a similar opening prologue. If you remember from the Fellowship of the Ring, we had that truly epic opening sequence. I think it went on for a good 5-6 minutes, really drawing you into the story, really immersing you into this whole lore of Middle Earth. And I think we could have had something similar for Dune as well, rather than just having Zendaya's narration and a bit of slow-mo. We had a few explosions when we see the Fremen getting attacked, but again, it wasn't nothing too exceptional in my opinion. They could have done a far better job in terms of an opening sequence. Now, I suppose they are following from the books and the source material, but one thing I didn't understand is why did the hurricane pull away from planet Arrakis when they were clearly the dominant force and they were harvesting all of the splice, but all of a sudden they were pulled away by the Emperor? I didn't understand that. Reading some background information, this was all some elaborate scheme to try and entrap the House Atreides into going and governing Fremen, and this will leave them more exposed. I didn't quite understand that tactic. Why didn't the hurricane just stay and harvest all of the splice and then maybe combat the House Atreides if that was the original plans of the Emperor? And another key ingredient I think was missing from this movie is that we really didn't get a full-on feeling of how important the splice was. I'll go back to Lord of the Rings again. When we look at the ring and the immense power and influence that it had, those films did such a great job of really getting the audience to understand the true influence of the ring. Not only did we see those in the prologue sequence, but we saw that right throughout the films, which each character came into the ring and then we would see them potentially getting drawn by its influence. It just made a good way of an audience understanding what exactly we were fighting for and why everything was so important. But we didn't get that with the splice. You know, we got some reference at the beginning, and I guess we had some dream sequences when Paul was having these visions, and apparently that was the impact or the influence of the splice, but you never really felt it. You never really felt why they go into such lengths to having all of these battles. I think they could have done a far better job of just making us feel the real weight and the real importance of the splice itself. I also think it would have been nice to see the Emperor himself, everybody talking about how important he is and how he's really the architect of all of these plans. I just think it would have been good not to have him necessarily dominate the film, because again, you have to have Baron himself, he was kind of the main villain, so I think if you introduce the Emperor and have him throughout the whole story, maybe it takes away from the Baron himself. But I think just again an opening prologue, just to see the Emperor, just to get some sort of sense of how powerful and influential he is, I'd rather we actually see that rather than have it explained to us in exposition. So again, that's something they could have improved upon as well. Now, we did have the earlier scenes where again we were establishing how important Paul was and getting some sense of his overall powers. Amongst the dream sequences, we also had that scene when he had dinner with his mother and they were establishing for the first time the whole concept of the voice and how Paul had to master it in order to influence others. Basically, it's like a Jedi mind trick. That's how I saw it. Again, many hardcore G fans may be upset about that because of course Dune came before Star Wars, but yeah, it's basically the mind trick, and we see that later on, of course, in that sequence when both Paul and his mother are being captured and then they have to master the voice in order to escape them. So that was a good little scene. And then we had the other sequence which they took as well from the film and also the books, when Paul has to do this test just to see, I guess, to test his temperament overall and how much he can handle the pressure, where he meets I think it's the main leader of the Bane. I think that's the group of them. They're a group of women, I guess, and he has to put his hand in a box just to test his mettle, I guess. And we had further allusions to that later on when Rebecca Ferguson was in that scene where essentially the Bane wanted the chosen one, I suppose, to be a female because they are all female kind, I guess. Again, correct me if I'm wrong if that's not the source material, but of course she had a relationship with Paul's father and they gave birth to Paul, and Paul has been the anointed, the chosen one to take over. So there's apprehensions as to whether Paul is actually going to be the deliverer as what it should have been for the Bane's species themselves, I guess. But as I mentioned in my non-spoiler review, it's just a familiar trait that Paul is the saviour, the chosen one, again, so typical what we've seen so many films as well, as I mentioned before already, with the likes of Star Wars and The Matrix as well. We then talk about the overall aesthetic and style of the film, which has been hyped up so much, and yes, no doubt about it, all looks very visually impressive on screen. But one thing I did notice right throughout the movie is how, in particular, Denis Villeneuve's style is so similar to Zack Snyder in terms of the montages and the slow motions and the panning shots, and in particular when we look at the ship designs, they had this very much of this wasp-like construct about them. When they're flying, the wings are very much flapping like a blurry wasp effect, and it reminded me so much of the similar ship design as what we saw in particular of Man of Steel. Remember that opening Krypton sequence? There were certain ships that very much looked similar in terms of that overall wasp design, and that's what it reminded me of so much. If you told me that this film was directed by Zack Snyder, I would have completely believed you, just because of all of the montages and dream visions and sequences, because Denis Villeneuve is very similar to Zack Snyder. He's very much more about all of the visuals and how a certain shot looks in terms of the angle and where the light is coming from, where the shadows are coming from. I think at times he got over caught, or he got over indulged in just showcasing how pretty everything looks, and I think this was one of the reasons why the film seemed to be dragged out to its 2.5-hour runtime. Now, I did like the sequence when Atreides are going out, flying out if you like, over the desert, and they're looking out over the harvesters, and this is where we get the first sight of the sandworms, and there was this big urgent rush to rescue. I think there was 7 in each harvesting tractor as the sandworms were coming, and this is a very good sequence when basically they're trying to get everybody on board of the 3 ships, and then we get that cool visual shot where we see the sandworm coming from the first time. This combined as well when we saw Paul having more visions. It was slightly a bit annoying because everybody was trying to escape and then Paul was drifting, essentially putting others in danger by waiting around, and that was recognised so much when the Duke later on told Paul that he's very important and he shouldn't venture out on his own. And that was another annoying thing because Paul just kept drifting out and having these dreams and nightmares and looking into the sky, looking into the desert. Again, as I mentioned before, this is Villeneuve really investing so much in the dreamlike sequences, and it just got a bit frustrating over time. Again, another reason why the film was seemingly dragged out so long. Now, another standout sequence for me was probably overall the biggest action set piece, and that was when the Hurricane attacked Atreides. In the beginning, I did wonder how the Atreides didn't notice them. You have those big hulking ships descended down, but of course it's later on established that the Doctor who betrayed them also jammed and destroyed all of the signals and communications. That's why they were able to come in undetected. But then again, if you look at how big those ships are, you would have thought as well House Atreides, because they are governing and securing the planet Arrakis, they would have had certain scouts and certain detection. So even if all of the technology was disabled, you surely would have had people standing on certain balconies or patrols, just viewing it from the sky. Basically, you would have seen that from the sky. So even if all of your communications damaged, just use the eye test. Just this big hulking ship appears from nowhere and nobody notices. So that was a bit of a stretch for me. I think, considering the fact that we are in this way distant future, you know, you would have had people just looking up in the sky and seeing, oh look, there's this big ship descending down on us, maybe we should do something about it. But overall, the sequence was very good. I loved all the visuals, great explosions. We have those good visual shots where we see all of the trees, it looks on fire, and then we see Josh Brolin coming out with his team to take on all of the Hurricane, I guess. And I think he died, even though we didn't see him died. I assume he died in the battle overall. They basically come running, charging at them, or perhaps he survived. Maybe we'll see him in part 2 if we ever get part 2, but I wasn't sure whether his character made it or not. But I'm guessing, again, I haven't read the book, so anybody who's watching this video can tell me if they have read the books. Maybe Josh Brolin's character survives and we see him in any potential part 2. We then go on to the next part where the Doctor betrayed Paul's father, and we get some information that basically his wife was captured by the Hurricane, so that's why he was betraying them in the long run. This Doctor seemed a bit foolish, because you would have felt that maybe he would have understood that the Hurricane was no way going to set him free. You know, there was no way, he had no bargaining chip, right? Yes, they were holding his wife to ransom, but he didn't know that the wife was still alive or not. So he just seemed a bit foolish to me. But that was a bit of a vivid scene where he takes down Paul's father and then sticks him with the poisonous tooth. So basically, when Paul's father bites on it, it will exhale all of this poisonous gas. So basically, the Doctor was anticipating that Hurricane might betray him, and if he does, then he will set plans to kill him overall. And then we had that weird scene when Paul's father is sitting down naked, paralysed amongst the table, as the Hurricane, or the Baron rather, was sitting across from him. Now I thought the Baron was going to eat him. That's what I thought. That's why he's naked and that's why he's coming across to him. Yeah, the Baron was quite menacing as a villain, very gruesome, but I think we didn't see enough of him. It would have been nice to have a few more scenes and have him overall involved in the overall chasing of Paul and the others. But yeah, this scene was very weird, and basically it plays out as I explained before. He decapitates the Doctor, basically indicating that he already killed his wife, and then Paul's father bites on the tooth and then exhibits all this poisonous gas. And it was a very weird transition, because we get that shot where we look at the bullhorn in the ceiling, and then later on we see the Baron hanging in the ceiling rather. That's how he evaded capture. It was just weird. They never quite explained how the Baron was able to do that. Again, we could have cut down a bit in the early parts of the film when we were talking about the importance of Paul, and maybe had a few more scenes with the Baron. But yeah, that was just a weird scene overall. And then we focus on another very good standout sequence where we saw Duncan Idaho in his ship escaping from all of the battles. We had a really cool shot where we see the laser shooting through and the ship was flying through, evading the laser. So again, that was very good visual. And we had those really kind of droning sounds when I think the laser was kind of shooting through the shields of the Atreides containers. They had those big hulking containers that we saw at the beginning when they were occupying the planet, and they were shining in blue, so that was indication again that the shields were being broken through. And I didn't get how the whole point of the fighting, when we see those training sequences, that the shields meant to be very protective, but it almost seems like the Hurricane were just fighting through House Atreides too easily. The whole attack seemed very one-sided. House Atreides didn't seem to have much of a chance, and this contradicted the whole point of how House Atreides was this truly powerful faction and the Emperor had to destroy them in the first place. So I just thought House Atreides should have been a bit more prepared for battle against the Hurricane. I didn't highlight the major dreams and visions that Paul was having, so I think the most standout one was essentially halfway through the film, when basically both him and his mother have escaped capture, and he's kind of having this freak out moment when he's just crying and he's going over the memories or visions, if you like. And we had this great sequence when basically we saw the epic battle, if you like, when we assume this is the Fremen and they're in all of this kind of golden armor and they're fighting through what we saw in the trailer, and then we get the face reveal that it's Paul, and then get other shots where we see the Fremen, and you can tell that it's the Fremen because they have the blue eyes as per the source material, and they're standing in the ships as the armored soldiers are cheering in victory. And this is basically alluding to the fact that the Fremen have basically taken over. They've taken over perhaps House Atreides, or maybe they've defeated the Hurricane. And this was one of the major frustrations that I had, because we're having all of these dream sequences and you're showing us very much more interesting parts of the story where the Fremen are seemingly taken over. But again, we may not see this because this was due, I guess, for part 2 or perhaps even part 3 of the whole Dune franchise as what was intended. But because we're not sure whether we get part 2 or not, we may not see this part. So at the time, it was like, I want to see part of this. So forget about all of the slow motion walking within the desert. I'm more interested in this part. I'm more interested in the battles and how the Fremen are seemingly taken over. But everything is done in such a montagey way. If you're not familiar with the story, or maybe you were disengaged in this point, you're probably thinking, what the hell was going on here? So again, that was one thing that annoyed me, that we were getting almost these kind of short previews of what's to come, but we never get to that within the film itself. And we had other dream sequences where we see Paul and Zendaya, I can't remember the character of the girl's name, but basically they're walking in these little caves and they're looking at these mouse. And there was another shot when Paul comes out of the desert hut and he sees the mouse again. Now I think this is something to do with the source material, that again later on within the books, it's all the part of how Paul assumes another name when he becomes the main leader of the Fremen, and I think that's what's hinting towards the mouse. Again, I haven't read the book, so I guess this is later on within the source material, but once again, you're just setting up more elements as to what we've later on may not see. And this was another fade of the film, and it reminded me so much of going back to Snyder. We had those visions within the Snyder cuts. Spoiler alert, just in case you haven't seen those. The Snyder cut where we got the dream visions of Darkseid invading, and then we see the Wonder Woman funeral, and then we see Superman holding Lois's deceased body, and then held by Darkseid, and Superman takes over the planet. That's what it reminded me of so much. This typical storytelling trait that we're seeing so much in the blockbusters, where we can't just have one complete film. Everything is built towards part 2, part 3, and building this whole cinematic universe. So we've got to give the audiences little previews of what's ahead in the future. That's what it reminded me of so much. And another flaw of this film, in terms of that flashbacks, was very similar to what we saw in Alita Battle Angel. If you remember, that was again giving us all of these flashbacks visions where we saw Alita having a war on Mars, and we would get a hint of Destiny Nova, because again the filmmakers are far more interested in what's to come rather than what's focused now. And I think that was overall a big weakness within this movie as well. We then come on to really the final act, which was very anticlimactic, where we basically had the duel within the Fremen. So essentially we had that sequence when both Paul and his mother were running away from the sandworm. They managed to evade it. I think this is again another moment hinting and how important Paul was, that the sandworm didn't attack them. Again, reminded me so much, if you remember, from the Matrix Reloaded, I believe, in the last climax of that scene, spoiler alert again, when essentially the Sentinels are going to attack them when they're outside in Zion, and then Neo is able to repel one of them off. So again, just the typical beats of the Chosen One, and he's got this special ability to hand off the most feared enemies within all of the universe. But then we come back to that climatic fight. So essentially what happens is Xavier, Bardeen and the Fremen, they set upon them. They want to extract, I guess, the water within their suits, I guess, because they had to wear these special suits in order to be able to survive within the planet. They go and attack them, and then Paul's mother easily beats Xavier Bardeen's, so she's basically now the de facto leader of the team. But Denis, I think his name, he doesn't agree with that, so he challenges Paul's mother. But then again, you can't challenge the leader. But this didn't make sense, because Denis, you just challenged him. You've just challenged the leader by saying you're not going to go along with them, right? So basically what I'm getting is that Paul's mother should have fought him, right? There's no reason why Paul's mother should have fought him, and she would have bested him easy. But again, we have to underline Paul's importance and how he's very much the chosen one. So in this quick roundabout way, in terms of the overall ritual, Paul has to be the champion. Even though Rebecca Ferguson didn't choose him to be the champion, he was just the champion by default, right? So he has a fight, and this really should have been a really impactful and a really tense driven fight scene but it wasn't, because Paul bests him too easy, right? And basically we see again these dream visions when Paul is showing himself to be defeated, it looks like, and we get all of this voiceover work from, I think it's Zendaya's character again, whispering that you can't take someone's life, or you can't take your own life. Again, I just glossed over at this point, but Paul just bests him too easily. We have multiple instances when Paul could kill him, but he doesn't. His mother refers to the fact that he's never killed a person before. So again, we should get this really kind of dramatic fight where Paul is struggling to really strike the final blow, but then he just kills him at the end. He just has his another vision and then strikes him down. So all of this talk about Paul being at odds with taking someone's life didn't really matter, because he takes the life anyway, right? And we get all of this wailing music in between as well, and it just felt really anticlimactic, and it just didn't really feel earned. I think it would have been far better had it been Javier Bardem's character that Paul fought, because he was kind of the main leader. Or I would have preferred we could have had a far more expansive moment as to say perhaps whether the Fremen was coming under attack from the Sandworm, and then Paul repels it away, and that cements his importance. Or even better, maybe the Fremen group were under attack from a chasing group of the Hurricane, and then the Sandworm is coming, but maybe the Hurricane is somehow attacking the Sandworm, but then somehow Paul is able to command the Sandworm and then makes the Sandworm turn on the Hurricane. We just could have had a far more explosive moment just to underline how important Paul is and how he's going to lead the Fremen as they walk off into the distance. But just to have him just kill Janice easily like that wasn't enough for me. It wasn't enough for me to really certify how important Paul was. So that was basically the end of the movie, where basically the last of the stragglers are walking away, and we're hinting at Paul now. They have to meet further Fremen, I guess. There's another group that's far more important, I guess, and that's going to lead to the overall battle against the Hurricane and the saving of the planet. And then we get that final vision when they're walking in the desert, and then we see the Sandworm, and then we see someone riding the Sandworm. If you see it, we get a blurry shot of someone on top of the Sandworm. I'm guessing this is hinting back to the source material. And then Paul says that's the overall power, and then Zendaya's character says, so it begins. So I'm guessing later on down the line, if we ever get a part 2 or a part 3, the overall power, if you like, is to be able to control the Sandworms. And when we get an eventual big battle against the Hurricane, we're going to see lots of the Fremen being able to control the Sandworms, or maybe as such that's the next evolution of Paul's power, that he's able to take control of the Sandworms and follow it through. So if we're going through a typical, if you like, trajectory of these kind of franchises, essentially what we have is the origin where we establish the protagonist and he exhibits some sort of amazing power that we only see a small portion of. And then the second sequel, if you like, is when we get a far more expansive battle. We get far more on the Hurricane and the overall other factions within the universe, and then we get a further big battle. And then the third one would be essentially where Paul comes to his overall mastery of his powers, and then we get a huge battle when we see all of the Sandworms getting involved against the Hurricane. That's the typical trajectory that we'd see in terms of the overall big franchises, if Dune is to be a franchise. Again, we wait and see if we actually get that. Now, there has been recent announcement that Warner Brothers has greenlit a sequel overall, but we have to hold fire on that because they haven't filmed it at all. So normally when you get these big budget franchises, like for example the Lord of the Rings or the Back to the Future, or indeed the Matrix films, they do the first film and they already start filming the second one, and they normally film these entries back to back, so you already have the sequel halfway or in the can already, so you can move forward with releasing that story. But they haven't even started filming the sequel of Dune, so it will be interesting to see if we do get a sequel, how long will it be before we get a sequel. Again, I think they're gonna wait for not really the theatrical figures, but much more of the HBO Max figures, because I truly believe that they were really designing this movie more to garner subscribers for HBO Max. I mentioned in my non-spoiler review, I think this would have been better served as a big budget HBO series, maybe a 6 to 8 part where you really could have delved far more into, for example, the Hurricane and the splice itself, and it would have been just far more of an expansive story rather than just ending abruptly here. But that's what I think they're going for, but we'll wait and see in terms of the overall subscriber count. I think that's what's going to determine whether we do get a sequel for Dune. And I think if we do get a sequel for Dune, it's going to cost far less than the rumoured 165 to 180 million budget that we saw throughout this movie overall. They're going to maybe go for far more smaller in scale. They're going to maybe go for a much more younger cast, I guess, but we'll wait and see. overall, because if you think about it, if this is the first part and this is just the beginning part of the story and it cost 180 million, then as I mentioned before, a more expansive part into the books is only going to cost more, and I don't think Warner Brothers wants to take that, especially if it doesn't garner the big box office that they were particularly looking for. So we will wait and see whether we get a sequel overall for Dune in the next upcoming future. But that's it really. Those are my overall major thoughts in terms of a spoiler review of Dune. Let me know what you think in the comments below. Again, I just think there's a certain overhyping going on with this film. It's in no way the next Star Wars or indeed the next Lord of the Rings, so just get that out of your mind straight away. It's not even close. It's a decent movie, great visuals, great aesthetics, but sadly, I just think it's a poor lead character, and I just think there was setup of bigger moments to come. And I think you could have cut a lot of the moments in this part and then introduced a lot more of the future installments, and I think it would have made it a far more of a satisfying, epic installment, particularly for a lot of general audiences as well. But let me know what you think in the comments below, whether you think this is the masterpiece that everybody's deeming it to be, or do you think it's a bit overrated, as what I feel about the movie as well. If there are any other movies that you would like to see me review, let me know in the comments, or indeed any other television shows that you'd also like to see me comment on, then let me know in the comments as well. Please also hit and like those subscription and notification buttons so I can provide you with more high quality content like this in the future. But that's it for now. Take care of yourselves, stay at safe distances, and I will see you very, very soon.